So welcome everyone to this final session of the Elena Avilar seminars for this year, school year. So this is going to be our final session, and curiously we came, almost back to the topic that from which we begin these sessions, which are the lots in astrology. We had as our first lecture of this new series of talks, Dorian Greenbaum with the lots in Hellenistic astrology. And now we're going to magnificently conclude with the discussion on the lots in medieval Chinese astrology by Jeffrey Kotyk. So let me introduce you very quickly, Jeffrey. So Jeffrey is a postdoctoral fellow in Chinese Buddhism in Canada. He has a PhD from the Leiden University with a dissertation titled Buddhist Astrology and Astromagic in Tang Dynasty. And Jeffrey has published extensively on the interaction of astrology, magic, and other such practices in the East and in Buddhism, Chinese, and Japanese context. Which of the ones he is going to talk today would be astrology, some astrological searches. So I welcome you, Jeffrey, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here. And I just want to also take this opportunity to thank the institution for hosting me. So today I'm going to be talking about the doctrine of lots in medieval Chinese astrology. So the lots are an important concept in Hellenistic astrology, and then also in the Islamic tradition, they were also important, and they're known also as Arabic parts. But before we go into the doctrine, let me just give you a brief overview of the history of astrology and specifically horoscopy in East Asia. So ancient China had its own indigenous form of astrology and divination, and this arose and evolved separate from Mesopotamia and India. This is important to emphasize. So astrology, as we would know it, for example, in the European and the Arabic cultural contexts, emerged out of Alexandria in Egypt in the Ptolemaic period around the 3rd century BCE, starting around there, and then it proliferated into the Latin Roman Empire and then eastward towards Persia and India over time. But the Chinese also had their own indigenous form of astronomy, and it was entirely separate from that of Mesopotamia. So the Chinese system of astronomy doesn't use the zodiac signs. It uses a system of lunar stations. And it also had its own form of omenology, which is comparable in many ways to what you see in Babylon. But again, it emerged separate. So it evolved separately over time. But Buddhism was one of these intermediaries for culture and knowledge and technology between Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. And so Buddhism from around the 4th century of the Common Era started transmitting Indian astrological concepts and basic doctrines. And this was primarily based on nakshatras. These are the lunar mansions. So although in some Buddhist literature, Mahayana literature of somewhat later centuries, like the 4th century, the 5th century Common Era, you see references to the zodiac signs, but they're more of a symbolic image. They don't really have much of a function as far as astrology is concerned. Now, although the Indian system of lunar mansions is mentioned in some Buddhist texts and so forth, it wasn't enough that they could actually practice Indian astrology. They had to the Chinese Buddhists didn't actually have any real particular need to implement Indian astrology at the time. But again, the interaction between China and the rest of the world continued over time. And from around the year 800 Common Era, this is when horoscopy, the actual casting of birth charts, is transmitted to China. And it was based primarily on Dorothean materials, and it was translated and then implemented in China, where it became quite popular starting from the 9th century. Now, Dorotheus of Sidon was a prominent Hellenistic astrologer of the 1st century Common Era. He predates Ptolemy, And Dorotheus was also translated also into Arabic, as we know. So Pingree and then later Dykes translated that. So astrology, horoscopy starts from around this point in China. It becomes very popular. And it spreads across East Asia to Korea and Japan, where it was practiced for several centuries. And also horoscopy was widely studied by literati in China. And literati are the intellectuals of China. They primarily gain their cultural authority by being masters of literature and letters. And we know from various historical records, journals, literature, and so forth, that a lot of literati in China practiced astrology. And this also spread to Japan, where you have a tradition of astrologer monks, the Tsukuyodo, which exists from about the 10th century till about the late 14th century, where it was quite prominent. So the point here is that horoscopy, in particular, the casting of birth charts, was very, very prominent in East Asia as a sort of subculture, as an art, as a technology. And this isn't necessarily appreciated as much in modern scholarship as I would hope it would be. So getting into some of the finer details, you had a translation of something related to Dorotheus. The Chinese text is the Duli Usajing, which is a phonetic transcription of Dorotheus. And it was probably a translation from Middle Persian, Pahlavi. It probably wasn't translated from the Arabic. The Arabic had been translated by Al-Tabari around the same time in the early 9th century, but it seems a bit too soon and impractical to suggest that the Arabic had been translated into Chinese. It's also that the extant Arabic version is quite different from the fragments that we have of this text, of the classical Chinese text. We don't have the entire text, but fragments of it are preserved in various sources in China and Japan. And there is a text in the Daoist canon, the Ling Tai Jing, whose title we could translate as Scripture of the Spiritual Platform, incorporates a lot of this Hellenistic astrology, but it's been modified for a new environment. Although I qualify it as Daoist, it might not actually have been meant originally as a Daoist text. It just ended up in the Daoist canon, which has hundreds, thousands of texts, and not all of them, strictly speaking, are related to the Daoist religion, but we can still call it a Daoist text because it's in the Daoist canon. Now, going into the actual doctrine of lots, the concept itself in Chinese, when it was translated in the 9th century, literally translates as flying assignments. So that's quite different from how the original Greek is understood, kleroi, so to draw by lot. You know, if you're drawing sticks, for example, and who gets the shortest stick has to do the chore, that's an example of lots. But in Chinese, it's translated as flying assignment. And so there's different formulas for calculating the specific lots. So in principle, you measure the distance between two positions in the chart and then release that same distance from the ascendant or another point. And usually these positions are reversed based on whether the chart is diurnal or nocturnal. That is to say, whether the chart is a day chart or a night chart. So whether the sun is above the horizon or below the horizon. So you can see in this illustration here that the lot of spirit in a day chart is calculated by measuring the distance between the moon and the sun, which you can see here is 3 signs. And then you release that same distance from the ascendant. So where that lot falls, that sign becomes the lot in question. So there's all kinds of lots, and the ones that are attested in the extant Chinese literature strongly parallel those of Dorotheus, which again gives a strong argument to suggest that Dorothean material was the main form of horoscopy which had been translated into Chinese. I have to stress that it wasn't like a faithful translation of the Greek Dorotheus. It was based on Dorotheus Sidon's material, but they also had added some stuff like the lunar nodes as well as references to the lunar mansions. But still, you can see that the lots that are in the Chinese tradition, and these range from themes like fortune, wealth, longevity, death, etc. A lot of them are quite similar, if not exactly paralleling what you see in Dorotheus's texts. But let's look at, for example, the lot of spirit. So the lot of spirit in Chinese astrology is said to signify one's religious or spiritual proclivities. So again, you measure from the moon to the sun, and you release that from the ascendant, and then you find the lot of spirit. Now again, so the sun and the moon can be any distance from one another, so the lot will change from chart to chart. So everybody's lots, unless they're born at the same time, will be very, very different. Now, what's interesting is that the Chinese text says that you can predict somebody's religious proclivities based on the planet, on a planet that falls in the lot. So for example, if the lot of spirit hosts, for example, the sun, then the native, that is to say the person for whose the horoscope was cast, will be interested in Daoism. Jupiter, alchemy. And so alchemy here refers to these Chinese practices of consuming various medical elixirs and doing different forms of meditation to achieve immortality. The moon, Buddhism. So Buddhism in this context is considered a solar religion. Mars, many rites. That seems to be sort of an emphasis on on priestcraft and the performance of rituals and so forth. Saturn, longevity practices. And that's really interesting too, that Saturn is associated with longevity in this context, because Saturn, of course, is the slowest planet, and he's also associated with old age in Hellenistic astrology. Venus, phylogeny, so the love of women. This is also highly significant from like a sinological or a Chinese studies point of view, for the simple fact that Venus in Chinese, like the indigenous Chinese astrology, is actually associated with soldiers and not with women, because Venus in Chinese astronomy is called the metal star, and metal is associated with weapons. But here we see the Hellenistic theme apparent. So you can see here that there's a lot of foreign astrological lore being incorporated into this new Chinese framework. Mercury is associated with literature, and so that should bring to mind Hermes the scribe, who is the messenger of the gods. And so again, that's not a Chinese concept at all. And Mars, martial valor. Also, again, in native Chinese astrology, it's Venus who is associated with soldiers, and Mars is associated with chaos and turmoil, but not necessarily soldiers. But here it's interesting that they have redesigned the lots to accommodate the local Chinese religious landscape. So for example, there's references to Daoism. Now in, for example, texts like the Picatrix, which is the Latin translation of the Gayat al-Hakim, it's a manual of astromagic. You also have associations between planets and religions. So Picatrix, for example, says that the sun is associated with Christianity, Venus is associated with Islam, the moon is associated with idol worship, and so forth, right? So you can see that in that context, it's, talking about religions of the Eastern Mediterranean. But in the case of China, when they were translating this, they had to find the associations for the local religious landscape. So if this had been translated from Middle Persian, we might assume, just given the context, that the sun might have been originally associated with Ahura Mazda and like Zoroastrianism, but that's not really going to work in a Chinese context. So they assigned Taoism to the sun, which was also the state religion at the time. So Taoism was endorsed by the Tang Dynasty rulers. It was the religion officially for the imperial family as well. So here we can see that they're not just translating the astrology, but they're also adapting it to the local environment, and they had to do that. So the lot of fortune is a different lot. And in this case, in the daytime chart, you measure from the sun to the moon. And so unlike Ptolemy, however, here the lot has to be reversed. So you can see again evidence that this form of astrology is probably coming from Dorotheus and not Claudius Ptolemy's work. And that's significant as well. And so the lot of fortune is held to be one of the more important lots, if not the most important. So you have to look at the position of the lot, the planets occupying it, also the planets aspecting it. And if it's a favorable position, then the fortune of the native will be excellent. But if it's unfavorable, if the position is weak, then the fortune will be limited. Now, also the text says that if it's a diurnal birth, then the nocturnal triplicity rulers are all weakened. And so what that means is you actually have to look at the triplicity rulers of the sign in which the lot falls. And the triplicity rulers are also laid out in the text as well. although of course it's been translated into Chinese. And so I could give the translations here, but you can see that the triplicity rulers, which is again a concept from Hellenistic astrology, is well attested. It's explained very clearly. And the point here is that so each zodiac sign is associated with 3 planets, and it changes based on whether it's a daytime or a nighttime chart. But some triplicity rulers, for example, are diurnal or they're nocturnal. And if the triplicity ruler is out of its favored time of day, then that also means that the lot of fortune is significantly weakened. And triplicity rulers is a concept that Dorotheus again emphasizes extensively in his book. And again, you can see this replicated in the Chinese tradition quite faithfully. It's interesting that modern scholarship, to some extent, at first, like in earlier decades, when people were trying to decipher this, they were figuring that this must be some form of like Daoist innovative divination. But in large part, I think they were confused because they didn't know the background of horoscopy. But once you understand basic horoscopy, in particular Hellenistic astrology, all of this makes perfect sense. And you can see that it's a faithful translation. And whoever did this, whoever translated this actually knew what they were doing. And we have some background details, some faint background details about who was involved in this, but you can see that they wanted it to work and they saw it as highly significant. And I think it was also probably seen at the time as culturally, if not also politically significant, because the rulers of China, the elites of China would have known that this casting of horoscopes was done in India and in the Islamicate world, and also as far as like the Byzantine Empire, and they wanted also to have this technology for themselves. So they clearly invested a lot of time and resources into translating this into Chinese, and it only took a couple of years too. So once it was translated, it was implemented right away. Now, one of the other interesting lots is the lot of eros, so the lot of love. And this is measured from the 12th house to the lot of spirit. Now, if the lot falls on Taurus, Aries, Pisces, or Capricorn, there'll be much love. But if Venus is present, it will be especially so. So Venus is a planet in astrology that's associated with love, sex, amorous relationships, also to some extent infidelity, lust, those sort of themes are apparent as well. Now, what's very interesting is that this is a rare instance in pre-modern Chinese texts in which sexuality is predetermined. So it says here that if Mercury is in Aries or Capricorn, and the lot falls there, and if Mars is missing, the actual zodiac sign is missing in the text, but then like mandarin ducks in a flowering tree, the native will like male charms. So what that's saying is that this is reading a chart assuming for a male client. It's saying that this person will prefer the company of men. Now, that's actually very interesting from like a Chinese studies point of view as well, because this is a very rare instance in which a text is proposing that you can predict and determine somebody's sexuality ahead of time. What that means that to some extent, sexuality is predetermined. And this sort of discussion is also in Dorotheus of Sidon's work, where he says that, you know, if you have this sort of configuration, then the person will be interested in men, or both men and women, or only women. And it also mentions what we would call bisexuality. So if the Venus and Moon are in the 4th house, then the native will have sex with both men and women. And so this is also highly significant, not just from the history of astrology, but also in terms of Chinese culture as well, because I'm unaware of any Chinese source from this time period that attempts to discuss people's sexuality and how it could be predetermined in this way. So this is also significant. But it also goes on to say concerning the lot of eros, or the lot of love, that if Venus is stationary, they will have exchanges with numerous people. And if Mars and Venus are together, then they will be sexually dissatisfied. Again, there's also the prediction that if Venus is in the 8th and Mars is in the 9th, then they'll desire for both men and women. So a lot of this sort of literature as well it seems to shy away from discussions of sexuality, but because this was a translation of something from Hellenistic astrology, and it was a faithful translation, they didn't edit it away or they didn't try to censor it. It was just faithfully reproduced. So this is something I'd like to actually research more and see if I can look into the wider corpus of astrological literature and see if this is further taken up. So moving on, there's also the lot of wealth. And so you measure from the ruler of the house of wealth. So that is the second house to the house of wealth itself. And you examine the condition of the house or the position in which the lot is in. So whether it's high or low, the aspects from the other planets and the ruler of it. Now the ruler also determines from where the wealth will be acquired. So if the sun falls in the lot of wealth, then the inheritance is from a past generation of one's own family. So it's hereditary wealth. The moon, inheritance from the wife's family. That's also significant because this is also something from Hellenistic astrology, that the moon is associated with women, and the moon is also associated with the mother. And also Jupiter, office, Mars, the spoils of war. That makes sense because Mars in astrology, Hellenistic astrology, is associated with war. Saturn, servants or underlings, but also agriculture. So that's not a native Chinese concept at all. That's again, you know, one of the Saturnine themes of wealth is that you acquire wealth that belongs to other people through proxy. So in this case, it's gaining wealth through your employees or your underlings, or also through agriculture. Mercury, acquiring your wealth through writing, literature, that sort of thing. And Venus through one's wife, so marrying into wealth. So that's interesting. So, but there's a difference here too, because the moon is inheritance from the wife's family. So inheriting the wife's family, and then Venus is getting rich through your wife. And there's a bit of a difference there. So it doesn't go into great detail on exactly how this is acquired, but there's a difference there. So there's inheritance. So your wife inherits the money from her family, and then you acquire that, or Venus is getting rich through the actions of your wife. But then this can also be disrupted as well. So for example, if a malefic is present, then the wealth will be destroyed. And this also talks about the head or the tail, which is a reference to the ascending node and the descending node of the moon. And that indicates that wealth will be lost in war. And that's also significant too, because in Dorotheus, there isn't this treatment of the ascending and descending nodes, because in Hellenistic astrology, although they definitely knew about the nodes, they weren't integrated into the system to the extent that we see in later medieval tradition. So this is, again, something that's been developed over the centuries. And it would make sense too that if this was a translation of Dorotheus from Persian, that there would be the nodes, because the ascending and descending node and this dragon sprawling across the sky is attested in Zoroastrian literature when it touches upon astrology as well. So the lots also predict longevity. So you measure from Jupiter to the moon. And again, if you have a benefic in the lot, it indicates long life, but an early demise would be indicated by a malefic. That's pretty straightforward. So the moon and Jupiter also would signify longevity, but it also takes into account the retrograde motion. So it says that if Jupiter is retrograde, then its signification of longevity is countermined, it's undermined. So that's also significant too, that this form of astrology in China is also taking into consider retrograde motions, and it sees it as a detrimental effect to the planet. So normally Jupiter would be a benefic, but its positive indications are significantly undermined if it's retrograde. So that's also something that the astrologers at the time would take into consideration. Death and captivity. So you measure from Saturn to Mars, and this indicates the type of death that the native will experience. So the Sun, Moon, Jupiter, and Mercury represent favorable deaths, whereas the nodes in Mars represent unfortunate deaths. So Venus, if Venus is in the lot of death and captivity, it means that the native will die due to a woman. Saturn, death due to the Tao, which I would understand that to be religious practice, because this Tao literally in Chinese means way, but it signifies in this context like religious practice, so austere religious practice. So in China at the time, aside from the Buddhists, there were also like Daoist monks as well who would engage in extreme aesthetic practices. So they might like eat very little food, they might expose themselves to the sun, they might live in a cave or something like that. So Saturn signifies taking religious practices to the extreme and dying from it. Jupiter, death as an officer or gentleman, so dying in office. Possibly also, in a military capacity, but in some sort of like official formal office. Mercury, death due to a cold illness. Saturn, again repeated, but death due to a stomach illness. Mars, a bloody death, and the nodes, the death from fright. So again, so in this system, you're also attempting to predict how a person will die, and that their death will be characterized by these themes if one of the planets are in the lot of death and captivity. So you can see it's actually a very extensive system of prediction. So we can see so far that it's attempting to predict your love life, your wealth, your spiritual inclinations, and also your death and demise. It also goes into this calamity. So you measure from the moon to the 8th house. The 8th house is associated with death and loss, that sort of thing. Mars and the Saturns indicate disaster, but if Mars or Saturn is the domicile ruler, there will be no disaster. So normally the two malefics would indicate disaster, but if the lot falls on the domicile of Mars or Saturn, like for example, Aries or Capricorn, and the planet is in that sign, then that means that its negative significations are significantly reduced or negated altogether. So in this case, it's also giving this very tempered view on how the malefics operate in the chart. It's not that the malefics will always signify negative things, but their negative significations can be significantly reduced if they're in their own domicile. So if they're in their favorite location. And also interestingly, this also goes into the annual perfection because you have the natal chart, and then you will attempt to predict the calamities in life based on the natal chart. But it also says that the lots can also be measured from the annual perfection. So each year of your life, starting from birthday and ending at the following birthday, that's one annual perfection. And the text also says that you can measure the chart, you can measure the lots based on annual perfection. So this is how the perfection system work. Each year of your life is associated with one of the houses. So you start with the first house, that's your first year of birth. And then it goes to the second house when the sun returns to its original natal position. So birthday to birthday. And what the text is saying is that you can, when the perfection occurs, you look at the lots for that upcoming year, and you can also predict calamity and these sort of things as well. So it's not just something that you look at the natal chart, but you also look at the annual perfections of the native, and then you attempt to make these predictions. But this also shows that astrology is an ongoing process. It's not that you just get your natal chart examined and then that's the end of it, but rather you have to look at the annual perfections and then consult with the astrologer over the course of many years. And also, this is how illness is also diagnosed as well. So there's a lot of illness, the sun to the 6th house. And so again, the planet, certain planets signify certain illnesses. The sun and the moon, diseases of the eyes. That's significant because the Yavana Jataka also associates the sun and the moon with the eyes. So this is an Indian Jyotish text of the classical period. And for example, I think it says that if the sun is in the 12th house, then you can lose one of your eyes. So again, this is coming from a foreign tradition. Jupiter, wind diseases, Mars, sores and bruises. That has a parallel also in Ptolemy in the Tetrabiblos. So Mars is associated with bleeding and sores and bruises and pussy things, that sort of thing. Saturn, pain due to swelling. Again, that's from Hellenistic astrology. Mercury, cold diseases, Venus, coughing, and nodes, internal diseases. Now, again, the lot is measured from in the natal chart, and to examine the lifetime as a whole, but you can also look at the annual perfection for that particular year. So the astrologer would look at your annual perfection, measure the lots, and then look at what's in the lots, the condition of the lot, and attempt to diagnose that in the coming year, you're likely to have this health condition based on the configuration of the planets relative to the lot. And so that's basically like ongoing medical and an ongoing attempt at medical diagnosis as well. The brothers, so it attempts to describe how many brothers you will have, or the absence of these brothers. So certain signs in which the lot would occupy would signify few brothers, whereas Pisces, Aries, and Cancer would indicate many brothers. But it also says that in some cases, if the lot falls on Pisces, Aries, or Sagittarius, it means that the brothers will be of different races. And what that means is that your brothers in this context would come from different parentages. And so that's also something significant. A lot of wives and concubines. So you measure from Saturn to Venus, and you determine the fortune by seeing which planets occupy it. This is interesting because it says if Mars is particularly inauspicious, even if the lot falls on the houses of marriage with Venus, but a benefic aiding this limits this. So Mars indicates things like adultery and destruction and these sort of things. So Mars in the lot of wives and concubines would indicate a difficult or disruptive marriage. And a malefic overtaking the lot indicates infidelity, malicious gossip, and a broken household. So it attempts to also explain things like divorce and infidelity and that sort of thing as well. And the planets in this lot signify different circumstances. So who your wife will be or how many wives you will have. And again, so this concept is clearly has men in mind. So it says if it's Mars, then you will have a courtesan for your wife. Jupiter, you'll have 2 wives, and one will acquire the wealth of the ladies. Sun and the Moon, one will get a good wife. Saturn, difficult marriage, and the couple will not be the same age. So a significant age gap between the husband and the wife. Mercury, one will get a good wife who comprehends letters and music. So again, the theme of writing and learning, that sort of thing. And the node that just says flat out that the wife will be evil. So again, there's a lot of themes here that you can draw parallels with to Hellenistic astrology. And this is how astrologers would have been reading their clients' charts. Also children, so you measure from Jupiter to Saturn. Benefics would indicate that the children will be born for certain. Malefics indicate harm. Now there's this interesting doctrine as well that it explains that the number of planets between the ascendant to the sign in which the lot falls. So you count the amount of planets between the ascendant and the lot, and that indicates the number of children. So the first planet seen is if the first planet is yin, so as in like yin and yang, if it's feminine, then the firstborn is a daughter. Whereas if it's yang, masculine, then it is a son. A benefic indicates a virtuous son, a malefic, a wicked son. So again, it's attempting to predict the number of children and whether the firstborn will be a son or a daughter. But it also says that you also have to look at the condition of each of the planets in this system. So if the planet is in the rays of the sun, so if it's under the rays of the sun within 10 degrees of the sun, or if the planet is retrograde, then it indicates harm to the child. And you also determine the power of the child based on the sects of the planet. So whether the planet is diurnal or nocturnal, and whether it's its favorite time of day. So whether it's nighttime or daytime. So again, Saturn prefers the daytime, Mars prefers the night times. And if they are out of their favored time of day, then you end up with a very sort of unfortunate circumstances. The lot of the mother, Venus to the moon. And so the harm to the mother is indicated if Mars aspects the moon in a nocturnal birth, and Saturn, if Saturn aspects the moon in a nocturnal chart, or if the moon is in a sign below the earth. So again, this is also stressing the importance of sect whether the planets are in their favorite time of day or not. But interestingly, there's also this concept from Hellenistic astrology about being below the Earth. So some planets are in unfortunate or unfavorable arrangements if they are stationed below the Earth, or if they're above the Earth. So in this case, it's saying that if the moon is below the Earth, and the moon falls in this lot of the mother, and the lot is below the Earth, and the moon is there, then it is unfavorable for the mother, and it indicates harm to the mother. Now, interestingly, there's also a very strong parallel with the translation of Dorotheus. It says that if the sun and the moon are in tropical signs, and also a tropical sign is positioned in the east, then the person's parents will be of different races. And if we cite Pingree's translation, if you find the sun and the moon in tropical signs and the ascendant is a tropical sign, then the parents of this native are not from one race. So it's very clear that this is a very evident, clear translation from Dorotheus. And this is also, it's interesting too, just from like a Chinese studies point of view too, to see how they translate terms like tropical sign, because like this concept of a tropical sign is from the Greek system of astronomy. It's not native to Chinese astronomy. So we can also see how they translated these terms, but probably through some sort of intermediary. But it's interesting that you have something that's coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, passing through an intermediary, probably Persian, and then going on to China. And then it becomes very, very popular in China. So the sun as a triplicity ruler, if elevated, signifies that the father is strong, whereas the moon as the triplicity ruler signifies that the mother is strong. So again, each of the zodiac signs has a set of triplicity rulers. And if the lot of the mother falls on the sign in which the triplicity ruler is the sun, then it shows that the father is the stronger one. Whereas if it's the moon, it shows that the mother will be the stronger one in the couple. And if the Venus and the moon are in a sign below the earth, the mother will be impoverished and there will be malicious gossip. So again, there's this kind of emphasis on looking at the specific configuration of the planets to try to find unfavorable qualities to the configuration. And then also the lot of the father. So you measure from Sun to Saturn. A benefic in the lot indicates the eminence of the father. Again, you have to look at the aspects. So see if one of the other planets is aspecting the lot. So the sun aspecting Mars, or in a nocturnal birth, or the sun aspecting, or Saturn aspecting the sun, or if the sun is conjunct one of the nodes, then it indicates harm to the father. And so also, as in Hellenistic astrology, the sun is associated with the father. The sun in Hellenistic astrology is the father, the moon is the mother. So again, these concepts have been faithfully reproduced in Chinese astrology. So I'll just wrap up here, and I'd like to thank everybody for your attention, and I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Excellent presentation. Very, very interesting. I have questions, but I'll open the floor for anyone else who wants to ask a question. Okay, we have a question in the chart from Edward. So first, in the Ling Tai Jing, was the ascendant calculated as the west? That is the bit of the ecliptic rising at a particular moment, or determined using a process like the lots? I recall reading in modern horoscopic books a thing called 10 Chinese characters, which I cannot translate, which was calculating using a method akin to the lot calculation you described.
So the question is about the ascendant. How is the ascendant calculated?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question, because they weren't calculating, the Chinese astrologers weren't calculating the lot the same way they were doing, or the ascendant the same way that they did in India or the Arabic or the Greek worlds. because they didn't calculate global latitude, and that's required to calculate the exact rising degree of the ascendant. But what they did was they looked at the time of the day, the position of the sun, and the time of the year, and they calculated the ascendant based on that. So, for example, if the sun was rising directly over the eastern horizon, then they would position the sun obviously there, and then they would know that that's the ascendant. But if it was at noon, then they would calculate which house that would be relative to the ascendant. And so it wasn't as precise, like it wasn't as mathematically precise as what they did in the Greek world, but it was still functional, because they also had different tables for calculating like the time of the day or the position of the sun relative to the horizon based on the time of the year. But that was calibrated to the Chinese capital. So if you were a bit further south or a bit further north, it might have resulted in some inaccuracies.
Okay, the second question is, I've noticed that almost all of the names of the lots end with the character palace. Did the lots function as an alternative means of assigning house significations, or did they act as an overlay, adding additional signification to the 12 houses of the horoscope?
I think that, yeah, that's a good observation, that the translation for the different lots is gong, which means literally palace, which is also the term they used for the house. And I think the reason that it was translated like this was because they were using whole sign configurations, whereas like in the Arabic tradition, you look at the exact degrees to find the lots or the Arabic parts, whereas in this case, it's clearly using whole sign configurations. And as a result of that, I think they just used the same character because they were looking at the lots as occupying the entire zodiac sign, not actually as a specific degree point. And I don't get the impression that they overlaid the lot significations onto the actual house or the place, and it was treated separately. So the significations of the lot were considered separate from the themes of the house itself. That seems to be what they were doing. But then in some cases too, it seems a bit nebulous, and there might have been some astrologers who mix the ideas, but then according to at least what the literature in Chinese from that period suggests, is that they were supposed to treat them separately.
Okay, Samuel, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeffrey. This is a fantastic presentation, and to me, totally new. So my question might, kind of show my ignorance. So forgive me, but it's a much more general question also, because I can't enter into the details. But I just found it, I mean, all aspects of what you present is really fascinating. Actually, it's a double question. So you at the beginning of your talk, you showed that the presence of these fragments of Dorotheus treatise dates probably from the 10th century. Is that right? So the first part of my question is, is this a specific moment in Chinese cultural history where there is a is there any explanation why interest for foreign ways of divination or omenology, as you call it, is kind of, it's a propitious moment? And the second branch of my question is about your remark that there's a quite faithful translation of the doctrine from the Hellenistic tradition to Chinese, especially the examples you showed about predetermined sexual appetites or orientations. I just wonder whether there's any way you could figure out how much, you say it's totally faithful. Aren't there any instances where this translation is also, I don't know, adapting or kind of, people talk about appropriation of of strenuous material into a culture, and sometimes this goes along with some transformation. I mean, they had to translate, they had to kind of transpose this into Chinese concepts anyway. So I guess there is some tweaking in the meanings that's unavoidable in any translation. But do you see any transformation that go beyond? I mean, as a contrast to this faithfulness, do you see also deviations from the Hellenistic original?
Right. Okay, thank you. So to answer the first question, the reason that astrology, and specifically horoscope, became so popular goes back a couple decades. So starting around the year 724, there was a translation of like esoteric Buddhist practice into Chinese. And this esoteric practice, otherwise called Tantric Buddhism, requires that you look at the time that you carry out rituals. In particular, when you create the mandala for this ritual space, you have to look at the day of the week, the planets, the lunar mansions, and you need to observe astrology. And the Chinese Buddhists were suddenly faced with this obstacle of figuring out Indian astrology in all of its complexities, but they didn't have anybody to translate it into Chinese just yet. And so there was this spark of interest in astrology as a result of Buddhism. And then a few decades later, Amoghavajra, he creates this manual of Indian astrology, which is very heavily adapted to the Chinese calendar. But it's not just for timing the rituals, but it also attempts to make predictions about the person's future based on the lunar mansion that the moon is in when they're born. And this seems to have been taken out of the Buddhist Sangha, and astrologers got a hold of it. And also the Daoists got a hold of this, and then they started practicing this outside of the Buddhist fold. And then this seems to have probably prompted a commercial interest in translating foreign astrology, and particularly horoscopy, like casting of birth charts. And we can be sure, just given the international scale of commerce, trade, and exchange in China at the time, in the late 8th century, early 9th century, that there were probably, people from Persia and India who were, practicing astrology professionally in the capital, and probably making good money off of it too. And then around the year 800, you have this translation of Dorotheus into Chinese. And it seems that this was endorsed by the imperial family. And it seems to have been riding a cultural wave of interest in astrology. It was probably kind of the same interest that prompted the translation of a lot of different sort of Buddhist rituals and magic, and also the importation of like exotic aromas, incense, food, spices, that sort of thing. So, if you had never been exposed to something like your horoscope, seeing this for the first time would have been very, very interesting, because indigenous Chinese, omenology and astrology doesn't deal with individuals. The original system deals with looking at the movements of the planets and omens relative to the state. So that form of astrology is only of interest really to the state. It's because it doesn't tell you anything about you yourself as an individual, but your horoscope is interested in you as an individual, and it applies to you specifically. So that became very widely popular. Now, the second question, well, because it was translated probably through an intermediary, it wasn't translated from the Greek, so it was probably translated from Persian. And you do have elements introduced that weren't part of the original Hellenistic tradition, like the emphasis, for example, on the ascending node and the descending node, Rahu and Ketu, the head and tail of the dragon. And so that's one example of that. In some cases too, it seems that the terminology was conflated. So the same term is used for the ascendant as it is used for the sun sign. So the sun sign is associated with your fate or your life. It's literally it translates as like life palace. But then the first house, which is also where the ascendant is also translated as life palace. So the terminology sometimes gets imprecise, and it's not always clear whether they're talking about the ascendant or the sun sign. So in those cases, it's maybe in the original translation, which we don't have the original translation, it clarified these a lot more clearly. But the extent texts we have from the 9th century or the early 10th century sometimes conflate these terms. So but that being said, I still think it's quite faithful. It hasn't been like so heavily modified at this point that it wouldn't have been recognizable to, for example, a Greek astrologer if you were to show it to them and translate it back to them, right?
Thank you. We also have a question from Stephen Johnston, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeffrey. That was absolutely amazing to hear, and I can only echo Samuel's appreciation and expression of ignorance. But nevertheless, I will jump in with a question, which is that, and you just touched on it a bit more in the answer there, that if this sort of mediated Indian Persian astrology is being imported as something culturally prestigious from outside, then presumably there were some people in China whose practices or values or existing status was being challenged or displaced by this import of new fresh things. And I'm just wondering, is that the case? Does it manifest in any sort of critique or polemic? Is there any kind of literature of resistance to this? And I was particularly thinking whether, and is there anything satirical if such a genre exists? Because I mean, just from having really only dipped into Helena Avelar's book on 15th century European practice, where the lots are still quite popular, there is such a proliferation of lots. I'm sure she has something about the lot of beans and your grain and all this kind of stuff. And this surely was ripe for satire as well as serious study and emulation.
That's a very good question. Thank you. What's interesting is that it wasn't displacing anybody, because you didn't have like a form of indigenous astrology that dealt with individuals, because again, the indigenous form of astrology is really only of interest to the state, and it doesn't deal with individuals. So it would have been initially probably received as a curious foreign art. And the main challenge to it being implemented, at least in theory, was the use of astronomy and ephemerides, so tables indicating the positions of the planets. Because under Chinese law at the time, strictly speaking, you weren't supposed to be in possession of those items, because this could be used for seditious divination. So you could attempt to predict the omens, or predict sort of planetary movements that would be unfavorable to the ruling household. But with the breakdown of civil law in China after the An Lushan rebellion in the 750s, it seems that those laws weren't enforced, and it didn't seem to stop the spread of astrology. So it wasn't that anybody was really restricted from doing this. And then the elite clerics, not just the Buddhists, but also the Daoists, got a hold of this. And then in like the later part of the 9th century, you have figures like Du Guangting, who was a court Daoist priest, and he's writing about like the horoscopes of the imperial household, the high ministers, and he's lamenting like, oh, well, Saturn is transiting through this sign and it's causing all sorts of distress. And it's this very sort of poetic literary language. But what that shows you, though, is that the elites had fully endorsed it at that point. But what's interesting in the history of Chinese astrology is that you don't actually have the same sort of critique or satire of it, or any sort of even like challenges to it, because there wasn't any discussion of the metaphysics. Whereas like in the Christian and Islamic worlds, they had to argue that this is a natural science. And that's why they favored Claudius Ptolemy, because he did away with this idea that the planets are gods. And he just said that they're like natural forces, they're elemental, insentient forces that affect the landscape. Just as like the rays of the sun heat things up, so do the planets have their influences. But on the Chinese side, because of their worldview, and also the fact that they were probably polytheists, they didn't have any issues with viewing the planets as deities. And we know that they did, because in the art record, you have the planets in anthropomorphic forms, and they were worshipped both by Buddhists and Daoists. So there really wasn't a negative reaction. The only reaction I know of was in the 14th century, when a court historian was complaining that people claimed that this astrology that they were practicing goes back to deep antiquity, but then he proved that in the time of Confucius, nobody had this sort of thing. And he used his historical skills to trace it back to the introduction by a few figures in around the year 800. But he was mostly just complaining that people were wasting their time on this, but he wasn't saying it was invalid. He was just saying that it was foreign and that it was a waste of time. But he doesn't really discuss, like, he doesn't attempt to attack it like on metaphysical grounds or theological grounds, because in China, they had other forms of divination too. There's like the I Ching, the I Ching, which goes back into deep antiquity, and divination was just part of daily life, as it still is in most of the Chinese world today.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I think we have two other questions in the chat, which I'll read now. So there's one from David Arman. He says, thank you. Do you know how the Hellenistic health implications merge with Chinese medicine as practiced at the time? For example, do planets natively maybe had different disease processes associated?
I have an interesting story. I did publish a paper in Asian medicine about this exact topic, and I would encourage you to read it. And if you want a copy of it, please email me, and my email is on the screen. So one of the critiques to my paper in the peer review process was that there is no evidence whatsoever that any of this astrology, this foreign astrology, had an effect on Chinese medicine. Because if you read extensively Chinese medicine, there's incorporation of foreign medical ingredients. That's, like things like from India and aromatics from Persia and so forth, but there's none of this astrology. That's fair criticism. And they said, on the basis of this, I don't think this paper is really so suitable for a journal about medicine, because you can't justify that this had any sort of influence on Chinese medicine. But what I pointed out was that, setting that point aside, we know that the astrologers, at least, were attempting to diagnose illness on the basis of horoscopes. That doesn't mean that, like, the institution of Chinese medicine in the capital would have endorsed this or really known anything about it. They clearly did not, like, actually incorporate it into their practice. But you would have had a sort of like fringe movement of astrologers attempting to diagnose illness, and maybe even, well, we know that actually they probably attempted to cure it as well through prescribing magical procedures. So they said, well, like, there's some rituals, for example, that are prescribed. So if you're, for example, suffering from Saturn, then you do a ritual offering to Saturn. Or if Saturn is transiting over one of your important houses, like your first house in your chart, that's a very sensitive point. And if you want to avoid disaster and health problems related to Saturn, then you do this 3-year ritual offering to Saturn, which is about the time it takes for Saturn to go through one zodiac sign. So it seems that the actual Chinese system of medicine remains separate from this astrology. It wasn't intermixed together as you find, for example, in the Arabic-speaking world or the European worlds, but it remains separate from there. But that being said, I still think there was an attempt at, like, diagnosing illness based on astrology. It's just that it was the astrologers doing it, not the physicians.
Okay, we have another question.
I can't hear you. Go ahead.
From Nick, would they look at the angles from the lots as well, and how much importance were given to the lots in interpretation?
Yeah, the angles are looked at from the position of the houses, and this is a whole sign configuration. What was the second part of the question?
How much importance had the lots in the interpretation?
Oh, it seems that the lots were quite significant, because in this Daoist text that we have, there's a whole chapter devoted just to them exclusively. And this Daoist text, unfortunately, there's only like one fascicle of it extent, so one volume, but it was originally something like 10 volumes. So yeah, it was very significant. In the later tradition of the Ming Dynasty, there's like some very extensive texts on astrology, and the one by Wan Mingying in the 16th century, it only deals with a lot of fortune. But that's only one text out of many others that were in circulation. We just don't have all the other ones. But at least we know that in the 9th century, 10th century, the lots were highly significant.
I'm going to jump in for just a question. And do they have, is there any special arrangement of the lots as they are listed? Like, for example, you have in Abu Mashar, he separates them by house, you know, he orders them by house topic. Is there anything similar happening?
Well, this is on the left-hand side, this is the actual ordering of the lots. And normally we would think, given what we know today, that we would think that, you know, spirit would follow fortune, but actually spirit is way down the list.
Yeah.
So fortune, wealth, longevity, death, and captivity. I don't know if there's a pattern there, but I guess you can see that they arranged it so that it's like your immediate circumstances, your fortune, wealth, life, death, and then your family, your immediate family, your wives, your children, the condition of your parents. I guess you could actually maybe even see this as, yeah, I guess this would probably show kind of the way that they arranged it in the Chinese was probably the progression of your life. So, you know, your starting circumstances and your prospects for a long life or a short life, your immediate family, marriage, then you goes onto your career and so forth. And then the last thing is like like, for example, the underling, slaves, distress, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Because when you put it on, I thought there is some sort of order here. So he's not ordering by the 12 houses as we find in Arabic texts later, but probably, as you said, by topics, groups of topics, in a very similar way that Ptolemy and other Hellenistic texts will do it. The parents, children come clumped together, and so okay, it's by topic, but not following the order of the houses as we see later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good, I never thought of that. Like, what's the ordering of this? And it seems to be the progression of your life.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you will reply this to already, but they wouldn't have any use of degrees in this practice at this point.
It seems that they were using whole sign configurations for everything, including also the aspects. So what we know about, for example, the Arabic parts, it's always degree based, but in this case, it seems to be whole sign configurations, including the lots and also the aspects as well. Everything is whole sign configuration.
Yeah, because I was thinking, and you know, my work with the Jesuits and their interaction, then with the Chinese much later in the 17th century. They do complain about the lack of rigor. They don't explain exactly what they mean by that, but I would suppose that it would be this more generalistic approach to the planetary position instead of their very precisely astronomically calculated family.
Well, the Chinese calculated the planets down to the exact degree, but with the house configurations and the aspects, it seems that they use whole sign configurations exclusively. So,
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? Let me see if there's anyone in the, you, Stephen, do you have?
Not really a question. Oops. Just a tiny comment that I was very struck when you're responding to one of those previous questions there on the overall sort of profile or significance of the lots in larger astrological interpretation, just giving that instance of the Ming source that is only talking about the lot of fortune. And I mean, that just very much struck me, because that seems to be the case in Europe, that you know, in the 16th century, in sort of publicly published horoscopes, there might just about be the lot of fortune, but not really an awful lot else, maybe one or two other lots, but it does seem to sort of fade away quite a lot. And is that your sense then, in the Chinese context, that you can have historically this great list, you know, covering all aspects of life, and does it just dwindle away in later sources?
It certainly seems to be the case chronologically, if you see how the lots are used. So in the period like the 9th century, the 10th century, the lots are attested and there's great detail afforded to them. And then later on in the 16th century materials, which I've read through so much of the extant material, there isn't really discussion of it except for the lot of fortune. And even then it's not that significant. It seems that they were dealing with other topics in astrology, especially in particular like transits as well. That seems to be in the 16th century, the main thing, like the movement of the planets through the different houses, and also their significations in the different houses in the natal chart and so forth. But what I guess that just means also is that the practice of astrology in China just changed over time. And the other thing is that we really only have a limited snapshot, because we know that astrology was practiced, for example, in Marco Polo's time in the Chinese capital, and he says that there were like people from all over the world there practicing horoscopes, including Muslims and Indians and Persians and so forth. But we don't really have any material from that time period. And even the Chinese tradition, there would have probably been like, you know, all sorts of texts that were circulated in different regions of China, which just never made it to the present day. And so there probably were really large regional differences as well in different practices. But unfortunately, the later stuff from like the 16th century, the 17th century even, it's either stuff that was mass produced by woodblock prints, like publishers published those astrology manuals, which there's really only a few of them if you think about the actual quantity. And then what was in the Imperial Library, there's a couple astrology texts that were incorporated into the Imperial Library in the 18th century, and those were mass produced as part of like this imperial corpus of texts, the four repositories of texts, and that made it to the modern day as well. But so I guess my point is that we have a sort of limited a snapshot of what happened.
Great, thank you. Fascinating.
Okay, we have also an observation, final one from Edward. I have an observation regarding the reaction to horoscopy. I recall that what is now known as 8 characters astrology, which uses in the indigenous calendar and does not use any planets, also started in Tang Dynasty. Might this be a reaction to this kind of planetary astrology?
Could be. I think the other thing is that astrology requires a certain amount of expertise in astrology, reading ephemerides, calculating planetary positions and so forth. So in that way, it kind of gets monopolized by people who are not just literate, but have some sort of education in mathematics, and they have the ability to produce horoscopes, right? Whereas other forms of divination, like the 8-character divination, doesn't require this sort of skill set. So maybe to some extent, other forms of divination also emerged as a reaction to astrology, just to capture a certain amount of market share as well. Because it would have been, astrology would have definitely been monopolized by a small number of people relative to the rest of the divination market, like I Ching divination as well, which is much older than astrology, like horoscopy in China, was also evolved, and it was also highly popular, but it just didn't require all of this background knowledge in astronomy. So I guess we have to kind of think of it also. I always think that we need to think of astrology also in commercial terms, not just cultural terms as well. Is because this is a profession for a lot of people who do fortune telling, and so being able to offer a service, whether it was astrology or another form of divination, would have been a calculated professional change or a calculated professional decision.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll wrap it up here. Was quite an interesting lecture, well, very interesting lecture, very nice discussion. So once again, Jeffrey, thank you very much for having the time to be here with us presenting this. I think this is a fascinating topic, and I hope you write a more extensive paper on it. I think that would be wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you everyone for attending. Much appreciated.
Thank you, and hope to see you next time.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.